Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me, so please tell me if you cannot. I just want to thank everyone for being here this evening. Again, we're talking about allyship. The event is implicit bias, and what did you say, right? Thank you, Joli. Thank you to my team. I don't want to forget that. I just want to say before we begin, excuse me, I just want to acknowledge the land we are standing on is stolen land, and we want to recognize the pain of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I also want to acknowledge the pain of the Asian community, the Latino community, and the Black community. The SDA is here, we hear you, and we see you. Obviously, I've done these a few times, so everybody knows I'm Misty. This is my team here. I have 7 kids. Love to be part of the SDA. That's Kevin, you can see his wonderful smiling face. Our goal or mission of SDA is to celebrate diversity through volunteerism and education. The mission also is to create safe spaces for our cultural communities and build allyship within the community. Since Joli provided me with a lovely intro, I'm going to read it for everyone. It's got a lot of really great information. And Joli, I love your shirt, by the way. Thank you. Joli has been an ally in learning for 30 years and fostering racial justice throughout the community with nonprofit, yay SDA, and community organizations such as the YWCA, Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial, and Safe Haven Shelter, along with active roles on committees focused on driving inclusion, cultural awareness, and social responsibility at her place of employment. She has also an approved YWCA social justice facilitator. Amazing, good for you, Joli. And we'll be participating in facilitating It's Time to Talk forums on race to the audiences of teenagers this April, and with the wider public to an annual discussion on October 28th, 2021. Please let us know, we'd love to advertise that. If interested, please go to the YWCA link, which we can provide for racial justice. Also to see the workshops, same place. Joli is also a co-administrator of the Black Lives Matter Minnesota Facebook page. Also want to thank Stephanie for that. Also, I missed her while she was gone. Joli just took a lovely, wonderful, powerful, painful civil rights tour the last couple of weeks. So hopefully that is part of this presentation. Again, thanks Joli, and thanks to my team. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Misty. I feel very privileged, and what a word to use, but I feel very special to be asked back again on for a second presentation in your allyship series. I am going to go ahead and put up my screen here. My first one, if anyone was not here, was actually Ally in Learning, which was an overview of allyship using many different definitions and how you can start your journey and get your journey going. So let me see. You will be on a journey with me in a technical world for the next 45 minutes. So good luck. Let me find where. Let's see here. I gotta stop sharing from, oh geez. See, like I said, so while I'm talking here, we all have biases. So everybody is going to be able to relate to this and hopefully learn and take and move on to your next step in your journey. I will be providing again definitions. I have 2 videos actually on the psychological perspective of bias, because that is not something that I'm very familiar with on the psychological piece. I will also be sharing what I am very, I cannot see where my, oh, there we go, slideshow. I will be sharing what I do specialize in, and that's history, and be taking you on a historical timeline of where we've been and why we are still here today. The guidance and awareness, I'm going to hope that none of you will then hear, like I said, what did you just say? The content was created with a white audience in mind. So those that are either starting the journey, wanting to learn more, or are already in that journey. Remember, this is not a comfortable conversation. So if you are starting to feel that discomfort, then we are ready to do the work. I also know that within the audience, there is our BIPOC community members that have joined, and I thank you very much. This presentation is coming from my heart, so I do apologize for any triggers that may come through the presentation, and I do understand if you step away. I also ask that if there's any feedback, I am happy to hear and happy to learn. So Misty just shared a bunch of information about me and all of my work I've been doing for 30 years. But one part of bias is also being that self-awareness of yourself. So I'll share a little bit more now that it's my second time with SDA. So self-awareness is being understanding of who you are and the layers that come with it. So I am aware of myself, that I am white, I'm female, I'm family, I'm a mom, I'm a sister. I'm Jewish, I am employed. My personal interests are reading, personal interests, travel, and then my personality is an extrovert. So I'm sure that was really something you didn't expect to see. Another part of me is I am full, strong, boots on the ground. So I did want to share this picture. This was one of the marches that I did do this summer. It was through Minneapolis. I was a street marshal. I was actually walking, keeping all the marchers safe, and keeping everyone, if anyone needed any help, any medical attention or anything, keeping aware of that. As you see behind, that is the row of cars that are part of the marshalling also, and we had stopped and took down East Lake Street heading to the third precinct. So that adds on. And why am I sharing the self-awareness? Parts of bias come in different levels. So the dimensions of diversity is something that we all need to think about ourselves as we think about other people also. So the orange letters of obvious are, you know, your race, your age, ethnicity, gender, accent, which I shared that I'm white, I am a woman. The discernible ones that are, you know, a little bit unrecognizable are in the blue: your culture, physical ability, communication style, religion, sexual identification or orientation, nationality, and I identified with my religion. So the core that are underneath that we just don't see of that iceberg is that they are not apparent. So we have personality, we have style, you know, my personality is an extrovert. We have styles, we have beliefs, family status, education, personal interests I shared were reading and travel, and our values. And these are things that we do not see until we start creating relationships with people and learn about people. The goal also is that this is created with the word intersectionality that I've also used before. And the goal with dimensions of diversity is that we will learn about each other. And as our worlds and lives intersect, we will learn to embrace everything about a person. And when we start to do that and we start to become aware, is when we can start to work through our biases. So here again, here's our definitions that if you want to catch, you know, a screenshot of it and take away, you can also, I do understand that this is recorded, so you can catch this later. So really, you'll be hearing some of the words through here. And so of course, our first ones, we want to make sure we understand unconscious implicit bias. That is where you are hidden, expressed indirectly, unaware of the attitude, opinion, and judgments, and it operates subconsciously. You're not really aware you're even doing it, or after you say something, you're not even aware and thought through that process of what you say. Conscious explicit bias obviously means is that you're very conscious of what you're saying and very aware, and you say it, and you are these are coming from places that either you're familiar and you're aware of what you're going to say and you're okay with what you're saying. This is a lot of the times what we hear from racist people. They're very conscious. They know what they're saying and they know why they're saying it. So there is the explicit bias also. These three words, they kind of intertwine with each other, and I always used to get confused with prejudice and stereotype. So prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So it's a prejudgment. There's no experience with the group. So it's more of that feeling type of response with prejudice. Stereotype is a wildly held but fixed and oversimplified image or ideas of a particular type of person or thing. And they are rarely, you know, newly created. They're actually recreated and moved forward and applied to different groups. So I usually say prejudice is that feeling, and stereotype is that thought, putting some thought into when you think about stereotype. And assumptions is an action that is accepted as true or as certain to happen without proof. And that is a lot of what we're going to learn here today, is that when we hear history and we indulge in this history timeline I'm going to go through, and we think about what we hear now, and stereotypes and characteristics and prejudice and all of this, these aren't fact-based. These are opinions that have, said from one person to the next. And it's sort of like the game telephone, where we start off with something and by the end of it, it's not even what we said it was. So here's a few. You'll hear about omission, which is a person or thing that has been left out or excluded. Distortion, giving misleading, and as I said, false account or impression. A new word I learned, this is a psychological piece, and we're going to have a video from Dr. Ali Mattu about schema. And schema in psychology and in cognitive science, a schema describes a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and the relationships among them. And you will really like that video there. Microaggressions, you'll hear that word. This is the big piece. This is about your racism interrupters that we say, what did you just say? Did I hear you right? But a microaggression is really, it's a daily common and verbal, behavioral, or environmental, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicates hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards marginalized people. And we will go into that more later. And then I've already mentioned intersectionality, where we need to start to learn who we are and understand who we are, which that may take education, that may take a relationship building, that may getting together with people, but it's the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, gender, religion, and more. Think of the iceberg. Think of what you can see, think of maybe what you can see, and then think what, until you get to know that person, you may learn that. So we are going to watch me struggle to bring up this video, why we have racial bias. This is Dr. Ali Mattu. He has a YouTube series called The Psych Show. He is a clinical psychologist, and he creates these videos to help engage and deliver for all to understand. And I listened to a lot of videos in my time here, and this is the one that just really stuck out for me. So I am hoping and crossing that I can get this one up seamless. So let's see here. We're going to go to his video and share. And I learned about the sound, share computer sound. Oops, I think I turned it off actually. So let's try that again. Oop. And there it is. So this is 4.5 minutes, but it's a very worthwhile 4.5 minutes.
Think of an apple. Got an image in your head? What color is your apple? Green, red, or something else? This image is a schema. Your apple schema is the average of everything you know about apples. This is how our brain organizes information. Our memories aren't made up of specific details, they're made up of generalities. Schemas develop early. When you're a toddler, you learn the word food. Later, you discover that fruits are a type of food. At some point, you understand that a round fruit with a crisp skin is called an apple. Depending on where you live, the type of fruit that's available to you, and the media you consume, you might think of a green apple or a red apple. As an adult, your apple schema might include pies, cider, the forbidden fruit, Isaac Newton, Rene Magritte, Snow White, and Steve Jobs. Schemas are automatically created and automatically activated. While they help us to quickly navigate the world, they also cause problems. Take this for instance. If you've never seen this before, your apple schema will be activated because this looks like an apple. But when you cut into it, you'll be surprised to learn this is nothing like an apple. Schemas don't just bias the way we see things, they also change the way we see people. Think of a successful CEO. What does this person look like? You probably thought of someone who looks a lot like this and not someone who looks like this. These assumptions don't necessarily make you racist. They're born out of a schema that leads to an implicit bias, hidden positive or negative associations about people. There are lots of ways implicit bias impacts Americans, but I want to focus on one racial group that experiences more implicit bias than any other: Black Americans. The founders of the United States justified enslaving blacks because their lives were considered to be worth a fraction of a white person's. This association of blacks with inferiority continued through Jim Crow laws that kept black people from accessing the same opportunities as white people. Lynchings continued through the late 1960s because the public and government did not value black lives to the same degree as white lives. While the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned explicit racial discrimination, the legacy of associating blacks with being inferior continues in our society through implicit bias. Even with the same resume, a black candidate is less likely to be hired than a white candidate. With identical symptoms, doctors are more likely to recommend invasive treatments to blacks over whites. Charged with the same crime, blacks get harsher prison sentences than whites. Black judges are more likely to have their decisions reversed than white judges. Police officers are more likely to shoot blacks versus whites in simulations and in real life. I'm not saying companies, doctors, judges, and police officers are racist. What I am saying is that they're vulnerable to the exact same implicit biases that affect all of us. Biases that go back hundreds of years are maintained through economic and geographic segregation, strengthened by our media, and entrenched in our institutions. These biases are deadly. More black people were killed by the police in 2015 than were lynched in the worst year of Jim Crow. This is why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important. Every life is valuable, but America has a history of valuing black lives less. I know this is uncomfortable to talk about. Some of us have benefited from implicit bias, while others have never seen any advantage from their privilege. But implicit bias is part of how we work. Believing that you're colorblind, unaffected by racial bias, that can make you more biased. If you want to create positive change in the world, you first have to understand how implicit bias shapes the way you see the world. Harvard's project Implicit will help you to do just that. I recently completed a test that revealed I have an implicit bias in favor of whites over blacks. Honestly, I'm ashamed to admit this, but I hope it'll help you to discover your own bias. Then we can build in an understanding of implicit bias into the work that we do and minimize the impact it has on our everyday lives. How has implicit bias influenced your life? What did Project Implicit reveal about your bias? Let me know in the comments below. I'm at Alimatu on social media. Be sure to like the Psych Show on Facebook and subscribe on YouTube.
Oh, yes. Oops, I have to turn that off now. Okay. So let me bring us back to my presentation. Oh, well, there we go.
For this presentation through all CEUs. Register at allceus.com/counselor toolbox.
Escape it. Escape.
I'd like to welcome everybody today to the
we don't
presentation
wanna
Love Me,
welcome
Don't
anybody.
Leave Me, Addressing Fears of Abandonment.
Okay. All right. So sorry. I practiced at home, but practice sometimes doesn't make perfect. So, all right, let me get my thoughts back there. So, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. So that video is what I captured that video. As we all know, when Misty started talking, we heard, we acknowledged the land that we stand on that was stolen from our indigenous peoples. We acknowledged of Asian hate that has accumulated recently. But what I really wanted us to be able to touch on is close with the Black and Brown community because of relating to police brutality and what we are seeing. And there is a whole great history that I think we need to walk through. And so I do have the first line is slavery, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, and we're going to go into that after. But I did want to touch base on the Harvard Implicit Association Test, IAT. Part of the resources will have the URL in there if you are interested in taking that. That is actually, it measures attitudes and beliefs that people may be unwilling to or unable to report. And the IAT may be especially interesting if it shows that you have an implicit bias that you weren't even aware of. My bias, I did not take that test. I'm interested in taking the test, and I will do it, but I can tell you from processing and how I process, I hate to say this, I'm sorry, Kevin, but I am, and any other man on here, but I have unconscious bias with men, and actually towards white men. I have a very hard time processing when a white male is trying to give me guidance and trying to provide guidance for me, because of my knowledge of history with women and the patriarchal society that we see a core in so many our religions and our schools and all of that. I have to work very, very hard and process when I am at work and a male leader is providing guidance. I have to process that it is in my best interest. I do not go to male doctors or male dentists. I do choose women. I think that the same diagnosis that a man would give me will make me feel defensive, and it will make me not listen and hear. If I hear the same diagnosis from a woman, I feel support and compassion. So I'm going to have to take this test, and I'm going to find out if that, or if there's something else out there that I'm not familiar with. So getting aware and becoming aware of ourselves is so very important. So this here, 400 plus years of history. This is a part that I had to cut down so small, but this is the most really important piece I wanted to share here. And yes, parts of my my pilgrimage, my civil rights awareness pilgrimage is going to come into this. I ended up flying into Memphis, Tennessee, spending a few days in Memphis, driving to Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, and Selma, Alabama. And I can just already feel my knees tingling right now. I am a big reader, and I'm a big person on knowledge. And I'm just, I'm reading all this, I'm learning all this. And I was wondering how I was going to grasp this physically on this trip. And my heart just blew up on this trip. So let's go through some 400 years of history here that we can kind of look and see why we are seeing what we see nowadays. So, this was the best timeline. I tried putting the timeline together. Let me tell you, Stephanie, who I believe is out there, but I know she's preparing for something at 8 o'clock Central Time. She is going to have to give me some lessons on graphics. But we see here the colonial era, which was 1607 through 1776, which at that time, it is referring to the British that came and they left their own persecution over in England from religion and economical process going on. But at the same time, what happened in that also was the American Indigenous Wars, century long, where the white men fought and took over the land from our indigenous peoples. And just a note in here too, of 1851, Congress passed the Indian Appropriation Act, which created the Indian reservation system that we're familiar with right now still, and provided funds to move Indian tribes into farming reservations and hopefully keep them under control. Now, I took that from a book, so I'm using wrong terminology there. But all that was is
Joli.
Yes.
I don't think your screen is sharing.
Oh.
We see just the wrong screen.
Really?
We're seeing still YouTube.
Oh, well, thank you for telling me.
You're doing fantastic. Thank you.
And your right is still on that one. Oh my goodness, you're going to want to see this one. Then maybe I'll make some sense. Do you see his timeline?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Well, I know I don't have that much time to go over, but I started with the colonial era. And the important reason I did is because at that point in 1607, there was no inhabitants here except for indigenous peoples that were using the land and living on the land. And during that time, of course, the white European settlers came in and they took that land. This is also the time that was going on with the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted 366 years. The first slave boat came to the U.S. in 1619, which is located Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. And in that time period of the transatlantic slave trade, there were 12.5 million Africans moved across the Atlantic. 12.5 million. The other part I wanted to include in the colonial era, and this is very important, and this is what I keep telling people and keep trying to remind people of when I say about American policing. It was also during the colonial era that American policing started with, and I was doing some research in this, and I did find that some of it started in Boston in 1636, which really the watch system was composed of, where you hear the watchmen, which were primarily volunteers, and their duty was just to watch and make sure that there was no impending danger. But the part I wanted to really have people listen and take that moment to even learn further is that it was during this time of the colonial era that the slave patrols were created in 1704 through 1854, which the South decided, we're going to have our American, we're going to have our police, but we're going to have this extra group here for a specific reason. And the South, they created it, and it was their goal to watch the movements and behaviors of enslaved people. The three main points of the slave patrols: one was to chase down, apprehend, and return runaway slaves to their owners. The second one was a form of provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And the third one was to maintain a form of discipline for the slave workers. So during that timeline, at 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. So that was enacted. So if any slave left the Mason-Dixon line and escaped to the free states back in from 1850, the slave patrols would chase them down and bring them back to their owner. And Harriet Tubman actually had she had a very large amount of money on her, and I can't remember the actual amount, but I had seen something in one of the places, but they had money on her, Harriet Tubman, as she was helping people, move through the United States from the South. So even after the slave patrols were no longer in action of 1854, there were still the community members that were allowed. And when I say community members, I mean hate group, the Ku Klux Klan. They were very powerful in the late 1800s, and they also helped doing, keeping enslaved people in their place, and even after the Civil War. So I want you to take with you from this piece, and I want you to think about what we see now in the present and where our policing has evolved from, and that they are the core history elements is not just individualized people bringing their bias to work, but this is a system creation within the policing policies. And I thought that was so very important for people to hear. Of course, we get to the post-American Revolution, and you see Frederick Douglass there. This was the era of 1776 through 1783, when the US became independent, is what they consider post-American Revolution. I want to look at Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists that were a part of that movement. And as I already had mentioned, Harriet Tubman. Here's a part of my trip I wanted to share. I really want to share this part. There was the Underground Railroad. That was a big system during this time. And I ended up in Memphis called Slave Haven Underground Railroad. It was an original Underground Railroad that was still sitting amongst all these new buildings that were being built up around it. Not too far from the Alabama River, where the slaves would come through the river, and when it was safe enough, they would go to this house, the Burkle Estate. In there, I will tell you, we heard the story starting from the transatlantic slave trade to so much more that I don't even have enough time to tell you what I learned about the Underground Railroad. But I stood in the cellar where they would come, the runaway slaves, the enslaved people would come in, and they would hunker down under the house, and then they would get to a larger cellar where you could stand up. There were 4 people allowed in at a time, and it took a long time to get me out of there, actually. I just stood in there I kind of lost myself at that point, and I felt so much strength around me. The enslaved people were such strong people, and every sense. And the stories that I heard from the museum curator, it has stayed with me. And every day on my trip, that cellar feeling has stayed with me, and it has continued to stay with me. So let me stay with you and bring you back to the history here. So as we can see, we had the Civil War. That was the time period of 1861 and 1865, which was also the establishment of the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery and the legal status of African Americans, which we know when we go down a little further, that wasn't just an automatic piece of the Constitution. We also see that the Reconstruction era is there, 1865 through 1877. It was the reintegration of the southern states into the Union. This is also where many African American, no longer slaves, were able to seek success. And this was the other part of my trip, is that during Reconstruction in Memphis, you probably have heard of Beale Street. There was so much success from the African Americans. There was banking, and there were stores and pharmacies and dentists and music and restaurants, and so much in that time period that I think about how our world would be today if we just moved forward and allowed the Black and brown people to live their lives. I just go back to that thought and think, why couldn't we have stuck with Reconstruction and kept moving forward and allowing? But no, that was broken apart when we get back into the Jim Crow area that you see. In that era is 1877 to 1964, when they believed that they didn't need Reconstruction any longer. Everybody was free. They took away a lot of the so-called protections. And then what happened with Jim Crow, they came into the Ku Klux Klan, came in and took over the business. And at that time also, the relationships built between the Black people and the white people wasn't working anymore, because of course the white people that were in relationships with the Black and brown people, they were threatened also from the KKK. So when we think about it, and I think about all of this history and this timeline, and I think about where we are today in the present, if the United States would just had moved forward. But we're going to move forward because we're going to move forward into Jim Crow. So as we know, if we can't keep people enslaved, like my shirt, from enslavement to mass incarceration, we're going to keep everything illegal for them. Jim Crow was 1877 to 1964. Mandated racial segregation in all public places, and also the uprising of the KKK again in the early 1900s. And they assisted the police in keeping Black people in their places and segregated, the white and the segregation. Okay, well, we'll give you a school, but we won't give you any books. We'll give you a place to live, but we won't have it clean and healthy and fresh water. So the segregation in the Jim Crow was going on. And I did learn that Birmingham was actually one of the strictest of the Jim Crow laws. And how I learned that was walking in Kelly Ingram Park a little late in the evening, and a gentleman just did approach me, and he asked me if I wanted to hear anything else about Birmingham. And you know what? I'm all up. I sat on a bench, and he shared with me he was born in 1958. He shared with me that he couldn't even put his foot on Kelly Ingram Park because that was only for white people. He told me about there was the bombing of the 16th Baptist Church that was just right kitty corner of that point, and he said that one of the young girls, Addie Mae Collins, who was murdered in the bombing, her sister was still alive. So Sarah Colin Rudolph is still alive, living in the Freedom. It was a Freedom home that was right on the other side. So what I'm saying, and I'm trying to say, is that this was not long ago. When we think of the bombing, when we think about the historical timeline of the civil rights movement, which we're going to move into right now, is that that people are still living who experienced this in, living through their life. And of course, we are also trying to understand and break down that historical trauma also. But I want people to also understand that this didn't happen just 200 years ago. This was back in 1961 with one of the big children's crusades that happened in Birmingham. There were 2,000 children that were also jailed at that time. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was in town. There was Reverend Fred Shuttleworth. John Lewis was there, and they were trying to be heard and remove the Jim Crow laws. So that was in 1961 through 1963. We had the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We have the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And when I think about the amendments they call the Civil War amendments, the 13th Amendment, abolition of slavery, ratified December 6th, 1865. The 14th, everyone born in the U.S. states, including former slaves or U.S. citizens, that was ratified July 9th of 1868. And then we have the 15th Amendment, that was the right to vote, and we shall not deny anyone because of the race and sex. That was actually ratified in February 3rd, 1870. So even with that amendment, when was the Voting Right actually the act? It was in 1965, 90 years later, that there had to be another enactment just so people of color could vote. As we see back in 1965, there was big movements to get people registered, and of course there was the poll tax, and there was all of that kept people of color not able to register, or the terror of the racial terror from the Ku Klux Klan. Another piece of it too that I learned is that when we were driving between Selma and Selma and Montgomery, the 52-mile walk there was tent cities that were put up. And after the Civil War and after the 13th Amendment, many of the previous slaves ended up living on the plantation and they were called sharecroppers at that time. They worked the land. They really weren't given much anything better to live on, but they were able to, a little bit more freedom moving back and forth. Well, when the plantation owners learned that the sharecroppers were registering to vote, they were evicted. So many of them would stay in a tent city and work their way up to trying to get up north, and that was kind of when the North Migration happened. So what am I getting at here? Let's think about this. We are still having laws that are being put in place in Georgia that are still going to make things tough for marginalized people for voting. So I keep walking through this history, and we keep walking, and now we're in our modern day where in 2013, as the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement was created after the verdict of George Zimmerman when he was acquitted from the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so now we have the hashtag, and we have something to work together, kind of that umbrella piece, and we're all working together, standing with our BIPOC communities and being allies. And so what I wanted to make everybody aware of, and maybe everybody didn't need a history lesson, but actually we really do need a history lesson, because a little bit later I'll tell why we need a history lesson. But I think it's very important because these are how biases are created. This is how stereotypes were created. This is how we are still hearing microaggressions that are constantly being piled on our BIPOC community. And so we need to understand where this is coming from. Just like I said, the word assumptions, a non-fact-based stereotype or prejudice. So before we move on to the next here, we're going to move on and learn more from Dr. Kyra Hudson-Banks on stereotypes defined. But I just want to point out is that this country has been created and sustained for white comfort through white supremacy. And that was there's so much more that I'd like to go, and I'd like to actually share more of my trip with it. But I think it's really important that we look at some of the fact base versus what actually really happened. So let me see if I can get my technical skills. So stereo is defined as by Dr. Kyra Hudson Banks. She co-founded the Institute for Healing Justice and Equity at St. Louis University. She's a professor, author, consultant, researcher, and thought leader. And I really did, this is only a minute and a half. So let me get this one up here. Let's see. Oh, no, I don't want to share that. Well. You're gonna see some of my fancy work again. No, that's not what I want. Let me go here. I'm sorry. I had this up, but it doesn't seem to be up anymore.
Stereotypes are mental shortcuts that we take.
Can you all see this? Okay, thank you. All right. We're going to try this and start this. So stereotypes are mental
that help us quickly understand a group or make assumptions about a group. And it's important to be aware of them because sometimes they're wrong. Many times they're wrong. The problem with stereotypes is once we have them, we have a tendency to psychologically confirm our stereotypes. So we have what we call a confirmatory bias. We see information that fits our stereotype and information that doesn't fit our stereotype, we just throw away. There's also different types of stereotypes. There can be stereotypes of omissions and then stereotypes of distortion. So sometimes we create stereotypes about groups because they're just simply not even in the picture. So we have to come up with the story. That often happens to American Indians. Sometimes the stereotypes are created because caricatures or distorted images of people are portrayed. That happens a lot and has historically occurred with African Americans. The hypersexualization of Black women, the over-aggressiveness or assumption of violence of Black men. So it's important to see our stereotypes and those shortcuts we take so that we can question them and be aware of how they might trap our thinking about other groups. Another thing, sometimes people say, oh, well, that's a good stereotype. But any stereotype that limits our understanding or ability to see somebody in their full humanity is not good. Stereotypes, when applied generally without thinking and checking them out, are problematic, whether the content is good or bad.
Oh, jeez. I'm going to need a sound person next time with me here. And we want to cancel. Cancel. Okay. Let's hope. There we go. Okay, so she shared more about the stereotypes, and I see that we're really getting down on time, and so I'm going to work through this next step a little quicker here. So are we seeing the right thing here? Stereotypes defined? Okay. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into this. What I wanted to talk about is here are some very old core stereotypes, and I call it The Birth of a Nation because the middle picture is a movie called The Birth of a Nation that came out in 1915 by D.W. Griffith, which was adapted from a book written by Thomas Dixon from 1905, and it was originally called The Klansman. So when Dr. Banks talked about the characters and stereotypes, this is exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing falsehoods that have created false information about people of color, and it continues as what we see in today in our microaggressions and our daily comments that we need to start checking ourselves and watching what we're saying. I do have on here I wanted to share about, of course, the Aunt Jemima was one of the most successful uses of Black stereotypes to sell a product, and it was first created in 1892. Here we see Miss Ellen Harper. She was a teacher and singer in Birmingham, Alabama. She was portrayed on the products in 1955 to 1957, which I do know Aunt Jemima, the products themselves do not have faces on it anymore. The other thing I really wanted to point out was the watch on the Rhine and the characteristics, the stereotypes. The reason I wanted to point this out is because I learned something while I was at Slave Haven. And I know that we've heard the very harsh and cruel comments about watermelon eating. I did learn that watermelon originated from Africa. So when the slaves were out in the fields and they would see the watermelon, it was something that reminded them of home. And they used to eat a lot of watermelon. On top of eating that from the connection from home, watermelon is 91% of water, 7.5% of carbs. Being out in the hot sun and being beaten and worked as they did every day, watermelon kept them hydrated the best they could. It also, with the potassium, gave them health hearts, and the other vitamin B and the vitamin A. So when we think of this and you hear people making comments about barbecues and about watermelon, what I always like to do is to learn more about what it is. But I was just that whole new evolution of this was it really hit me. And so I just wanted to make sure people could see that here is a core of what we still see today. Modern era US, right there. Big Lake High School, Big Lake, Minnesota, April 27th, 2021. The promposal. This is why we need to learn our history. This is why we as allies need to speak up and say something and use those racism interrupters when people are making comments or using microaggressions against people of color. This was just in 2021. And this could be subconsciously or non-consciously, but unfortunately, I think kids nowadays are a little smarter than this. So we all know that we need to be smarter with our children. We need to get our schools to put in education of the timelines and the history that we just heard just earlier. But this is why we need to understand our biases. This is why we need to check ourselves. So microaggressions, I wanted to share a little bit more about the microaggressions and on that. So they're little things that we hear or see that remind us that someone is of another group and not part of the dominant culture. So microaggressions exist in all aspects of our lives, and I'm going to bring it back again to intersectionality. There's many different layers of people, and again, we need to learn and we need to embrace that whole person. Microaggressions are the tangible effect of our privilege seeping out when we aren't paying attention. Right here we have the intent versus impact. It's also an excellent example of that intention of the aggressor is neutral, or they thought it was a good comment, the theme there, but in actuality is very, very, very harmful. And I have heard from friends of mine that are very, that are people of color that just say, every day, it's not just once I hear something, but it's every day and all day long that I'm hearing these microaggressions all day long, and it's called the pile-on effect. And so this is why we need to start thinking about what are we saying, how are things in our brain. Everything from history is coming out of our mouth still, and they're inaccurate comments. And I just want to say, if you do say something, because again, this is implicit bias or subconscious. If you say something, acknowledge it if someone points it out. Don't explain and don't think you are the victim, because you are not the victim. You stop, you listen, and you apologize very sincerely and listen to what you learned and make sure you think about it. The one thing I just want to point out here before we go to our last screen here is about color blindness. I know that we hear this a lot, that, oh, I don't see color. Well, unfortunately, when we say that and we hear that, the intent is is, well, when I look at you, I don't see color. I don't see any different than me. We're denying a person's racial, ethnic experience. The America is a melting pot. That's that assimilation to the dominant culture. And that's exactly what happened with boarding schools, with our indigenous peoples, assimilation there. And I always like to say, okay, if we have to use anything and think about anything with the United States, because everything has to have a category, could we think of this as a salad? Every bite you take of a salad tastes different. So if we need to have a pot of anything, why don't we call it a salad, where your tomatoes taste different, your cucumbers taste different, whatever you put in that salad, it's its own individual flavor, and it adds to the whole salad. There's also the intent of there's only one race, the human race, and you are denying an individual as, racial and cultural being. We are so rich of diversity, and we need to start learning and loving one another and speaking out. And that is the one thing, as allies, this is your time to use those racism interrupters. This is your time to say, what did you just say? This is your time. That's very harmful what you said. That's not funny. Staying silent, as I've said before, is silent. White silence is violence. If you are not speaking out, you're not doing the work. You're not taking what you're learning and you're doing the work. So when you are aware of it, it is your role to put it into action, and your intent is to educate that person. So the last thing I wanted to say, so what do we do? How do we fix this? What do we do next? That's the big thing. Okay, Joli, you told me about history. Yay, we got history. We see that history has not been taught because we see currently what we're still seeing, publicized in the United States, just locally right here in Minnesota. This is one of my favorite thoughts. It's very easy. It's very simple. Our intuition and instinct is 95% of our brain, that unconscious, that fast automatic pilot. And then we have our rational thinking, which is only 5%, where it takes effort. Slow down before you speak. Be logical when you think. I don't really like the word lazy, because I don't think if you're thinking slow, you're lazy. I think you're actually pretty smart. And indecisive, yeah, I can be indecisive. So yeah, and then sometimes you come out with the right thing, or maybe it's actually turns out to be the intuition and instinct. If we can move that little dial over more than just 5%, we can start thinking before we say, because again, to start this, we are all biased. We all have biases. It's just about how we are aware of who we are and who everyone else is, and embracing who we are. And so I'll end it here with the quote that I really loved and I picked up from Dr. Ali Matu. Discover your own bias, then we can build an understanding of implicit bias into the work that we do, and minimize impact it has on our everyday life. So everyone who joined here tonight, I thank you very much for letting me share this information that I found very true to my heart and very important for us to hear. Just a little minimal piece of awareness, a little piece that you can use in your day. But if we can start understanding our biases, and we can start understanding each other, and we can be aware, and we can think about that iceberg and that dimension of how amazing people are, and start embracing that, we can start to make change. So that's what I have to share. And let's see, questions. I do want to say, I just want to share this too here. So I on the top there, I've been working really, really hard. I'm trying to get a blog up, and my blog name came to me. So I'm going to share more information, with SDA. We can get that out there too. But allyship to me equals awareness to action to accomplice. So what kind of questions are out there?
Joli, since
Yes.
I can't see the variety of people here, maybe I would like 2 questions.
Okay.
First, maybe a little bit deeper, how you relate a schema. Like when you think of a schema, what are you thinking? And then the second question, if we're thinking about more professional people like Black doctors, Black dentists, things that would come up for them that maybe wouldn't come up for a white doctor or a white dentist, more of in a professional setting. Maybe we don't think those things are true, but how they look in that setting versus in your just everyday interaction.
Okay, so the first one with the schema, what I seem to pull away is that cognitive and being aware. And when we grow and our brain starts to grow, is that we have very minimal grasping. I'm going to go back to the apple because that one was a good one. So when we think of an apple, we just, we think maybe red or green. We just think of that one apple. And as our cognitive, as we grow and as we expand in learning, there's more parts to the apple. So I guess when I compare it to a human being, I think about, a little, a child, and the children they're all children, everybody's running around as a child. They're all little people there. And as they get older, they start to realize that there's different personalities and different type of people. And it's that cognitive learning and that psychological piece that you start to just automatically trigger your brain. And when you hear about it, what a teenager is, because when we think of a teenager, sometimes we don't always think of the positive of a teenager. We have to shift our brain and remind ourselves that teenagers are also wonderful little, people too. So when I think about a schema, I think of the cognitive growth of just something very simple, and how as we get older and we learn more, and how that gets bigger, and then how more adds on to it, where we end up getting the assumptions and the stereotypes and building it from there. The second question was kind of big. So you're talking about, so let me see if I understood. So what you're saying, that if a Black doctor or a Black dentist, what they may face every day at their work, when they work, like, okay, let's just, as an example, I guess for me, examples are the best way, maybe I'm understanding. So let's just say I ended up with a doctor, and I thought it was a woman. Actually, that did actually happen to me. My mother thought that this doctor first name was Kim, thought it was a woman. So I'm 18 years old, and I go and tell him I have this appointment. And when you're 18 years old, it's not just a hit on the knee. Dr. Kim was a man. So I'm going to trigger that back into, though, what my thoughts would be is if it was a Black doctor or a Black dentist, is that I think that there would be great, a stereotype will be created if that person doesn't have a part of their network and is very cultural. They may not feel comfortable with the dentist. And my understanding from talking, I do know, so my waxer, she is, she's Latino, and she has had some really mean white people when, again, her name and everything, no one would know who she is. They come in and they treat her horribly through the whole process. And unfortunately, that happens every day. And I can see that. I'm not a professional, and I've done no research on it, but I would think that your biases will kick in. And if you're uncomfortable with whom you're going to spend that time with, you will either be quiet or a defense mechanism, or you may even say, can I see a different doctor? So I am not knowledged in research to answer that much thoroughly, but when I think about biases and I think about each individual person, each person's going to face that differently. But I'm sure that microaggressions with people of color in the professional world or any world, every day they feel it. Every day they go home and they feel that, and they've got to get up the next day and just do it over again. That's the best I can say. It was, and anybody want to unmute or anything and ask me a question?
Can you tell me your blog name again real quick? I'm sorry, Kelly.
No, go ahead.
Can you tell me your blog name again, Julie?
When I get it up, it's going to be allyship equals awareness to action to accomplice. Because really with allyship, it's your awareness of self, your action of intention, and your accomplice to support.
The feedback that we got, which is really good, which, yes, I agree with this statement. She just said there's a lot of information to absorb.
Oh,
There
yeah.
really is a lot of information to absorb, especially with history. I can say honestly, as a Black female, some of that history I didn't know, and it's not because I'm not well educated. It's just, you know, and for myself, I went to an all white school in an all white world. So there's just things you don't learn unless you go find them. So for you, like, you've went and found them. So thank you.
Yes, I know. And I tried so hard to keep it minimal. I have so much to share. So good. I hope I get to come back. And each time I do come back with SDA, I try to make it smaller and smaller. But there is, and I really mean it. I really mean we need to learn our history. I know in a conversation I had with a coworker that says, can't we just move on? And I said, but we haven't done anything right. What are we moving on from? What have we not fixed? What have we not learned so that we don't do it again? And I will, the piece that I learned about the slave patrols really was a very interesting part of history that I connect to with what we're seeing today, and what's embedded, you know, and embedded in our policing system. And it's a big thing that we need to hold the police accountable, and there's a lot more work to do, but there is a very deep down core issue with policing in itself. And I think that's important for people to understand that, on top of everything else.
Yeah. I agree. For me, myself, I learned that history much later in life as an adult about policing. And that's really difficult to hear, especially as like that was my career before I chose to stay home. So that's painful to hear. It's like you're almost part of the problem and not the solution, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah. When I was working with Safe Haven, I was a legal advocate with showing up on the weekends for domestic assault. And I worked very closely with our police department, and that was in Duluth, Minnesota, actually. And I also went to school for criminal justice. So here I've got the book side of things, but then when you actually put it to action, nobody does the training when you're out in the field. It's very different. It's all very personalized. They've got their training, but then they have, like I said, they have their own biases that is bringing in. Until policing and police communities start to say, we're not allowing this behavior, because you're out, you're going to continue to see everybody doing whatever they want to do and what has always felt right to them.
Joli, when you went through kind of that timeline slide, it reminded me of a book that I had read, and I know I need to read a new edition of it, but Lies My Teacher Told Me was fascinating. So as a resource for people who want to not just read about history, but kind of change their view on potential implicit bias that you have, it is a great, great read. It's a little heavy, not just content-wise, but the actual verbiage, you know, it's just a harder read, but it is a hard look at reality on what we've been taught in schools.
Yes, and I do have that in my bookshelf too. Just I bought $300 worth of books on my trip. Every museum I went to, not only that, but shirts. This is from the Legacy Museum, the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson. And if you've read of the book, Just Mercy. So this was another point of history about from enslavement to mass incarceration and how it's been done also. But yes, I have $300 worth of books that I picked up, and I am trying to read through them. So when I go to Florida in 7 days, I'm going to bring all of them on the beach.
Joli will also be asking you for book club in the future, so just keep that. We do have a question.
Okay.
With education being power, how do you think teachers and educators can incorporate implicit bias awareness into the curriculum? It's helpful for adults, but I'm curious how, say, high schoolers can learn this, which is fantastic. It's an excellent question.
That is an excellent question, and I wish I was a teacher, but I know right now it's very hard for teachers to go and outside the box and bring some of this into their classroom. There's quite a bit of hesitancy by the schools. So unfortunately, what I think that teachers need to do is maybe start out kind of sterile with what a bias is and how we create a bias, and using, like, I'm going to, like, my work, we have unconscious bias training that I actually facilitate, and I am just kind of sickened at how sterile it is, because it really doesn't face what it is. But what we talk about and what we could do with kids is really trying to explain, what I like to do with the teenagers is to make a comment, start a comment, a true fact-based comment, and play the game telephone, and see in the end how that comes out and how people interpreted that statement from the start to the end. And the teacher could actually make the little slips of paper, hand them to each student. The when fact starts, then, you know, the next person would have it, and the next person would say, and the next person would say, and then come out in the end. And usually in the end is not going to be the same thing as what the actual fact is. And, you know, then they can start talking about how things get distorted, how things become a lie, and how you look into making sure that what you are saying is true, or how it's being delivered. So unfortunately, I see so much pushback when I read in the paper of having a really strong anti-racist training. But I think teachers could do it a different way and use context that's sterile, as I like to call it. But they certainly could be putting the implicit bias. You could be using, like Dr. Ali, fruit, use another type of theme and work with it. But there could be a way to do it.
Just a reference for everybody, since we're really highlighting books. Heidi, since Heidi is our wonderful technical person, when she sends out the thank yous, the link from the library typically goes along with that. And the library director was actually going to join us, and he wasn't able to tonight, but there'll be local, I mean, you can go to the library here in Scott County and collect those books, or get those books, or put them on hold, and then make sure you get the information. They were really glad to partner in this and offer that resource. Another comment or question, think too, for youth and adults, so much is how people are being manipulated on social media. I do think kids hate the thought of being manipulated. So how do you think maybe manipulation plays into implicit bias?
Well, first of all, I need to Google manipulation, so I would be referring to that, but manipulate to make someone change their thoughts, and I guess kind of almost a little bit like brainwashing. You know, social media has been a good thing and a bad thing. We have it at our fingertips right away to double check something if we're going and fact basing it, right? But so manipulating, that's a really hard one. I think you know, what I've learned before with social media and thinking about our kids is that parents need to have an open communication line and know what their kids are watching and listening and doing, because their kid could be the bully online on social media, and or they could be the ones that are being bullied. And so when we think about the word manipulation, and we think about assumptions, and we think about false information, if our teenagers are using a social media and you are paying that bill, then you have a right to see what's going on there. And I know back in the what was it, 1999, with dial-up AOL that we had in our house, the only AOL that they could do was out in the living room, where mom could stand over the shoulder and could watch. Well, then all of a sudden we get it in our hands, and we don't have that much control anymore. But actually, as parents, we really do. We can go in and check texts. We can go in, we can take that phone. If we're paying it, we can take that phone. Your job as a parent isn't really to be friends at that time. And so if you are, you're worried about manipulation, or you're worried about your child, or your child with someone else, then as a parent, you need to step up and see what's going on.
Joli, I have a question.
Yes.
It's been estimated that within the next 20 years or so, by the year 2040, that with a changing demographic in this country, that whites will be a minority in this country by the year 2040, 2042 or so, next 20 years or so. And when you see right now the rise of all of these supremacist groups and nationalist groups and in politics and so forth, as we march towards that next 20 years, do you see this getting worse? Or, I mean, I know it's impossible to make a prediction, but do you see that getting worse? Or do you think that it's because of the fear of that right now that these groups are rising, that as we inch towards that more balance of whites and blacks in this country, do you think that eventually things will balance out? Do you think this is just this is like an ebb and flow, or do you think it's going to continue to get worse with these supremacist groups and so forth?
I think there are less people in supremacy groups right now, but again, in 20 years, what could we see that shift? But I also see, when I think of all of the marches and the history of the civil rights movement, and even before, you really didn't see a lot of white faces in the groups. What I'm hoping to see, and what we're really doing, and what SDA is doing with allyship and education, is helping white people get in with and learn the systems, learn what to do, learn how to be a racist interrupter, learn how to educate, raise anti-racist children, and really getting in there and being a part of that. I think that, again, if we get something like Trump back in there, because it really wasn't that many people, but it was enough violence to make it look like there was more people in this world that is actually on the supremacist. And again, this is just assumptions. These are not facts that I'm saying with you right now. But what I can see is that the more people we educate right now, and the more people that get involved, that we will have hopefully a community that in 20 years understands each other better, and we're with each other, and we'll fight against the supremacy, and we'll fight against the hate. The other thing too is that if we have a police department and policing and sheriff's department that are finally in a position to actually protect and serve all community members, they won't be allowed to do what we saw, the racial terror in the back, because the police were just closing a blind eye. But that is a very good question, and that is why right now we have to start learning about one another, participating. So like Fred Hampton from the Black Panther said, we're stronger in numbers. Right. And more white people being involved with this new, movement. I call it more of a human rights, the human rights piece of it. We can take those, the supremacists. I mean, being Jewish, when I heard that there was a Nazi group that were coming to Minneapolis in May, I mean, it terrified me too. So we just all have to hear that, come to these great presentations that SDA does and other communities, and go to workshops and learn how can we make change and be together, so we can tackle that.
Thank you.
That's a good question. I want to think about that one more too. But I have heard that. The question I'm going to throw out there is like, yeah, this, one of my slides that said, this country has remained comfortable for white people. And if we do not have, there's not the numbers of white people anymore, is it going to be the lesser numbers that are going to still keep that oppression and control, that white supremacy? So I'm even interested to see how that will change. And I can only hope. That's all. And I mean, if we can start to educate our children younger and teach our children and network and bring people into our children's lives from all over, culturally, race, sexual orientation, just everybody, that whole diverse perspective, and embrace a whole person, not just parts of a person, that I can see something better in 10 years too. Because I just think about the 80s, you know, fighting for my friends who were gay, just certain rights that, you know, oh my gosh, now they can be married. And I always used to say, why do you want to be married? I'm heterosexual. I have that opportunity. It ain't the greatest thing, you know, but hey, you know, but I totally get why it's there and why everybody, you know, so if I think about that, and I'm very upfront, I'm sorry, I'm just very blunt. But when I think about how I supported and the whole pride piece and how we've come, but scary thing too is that each new Congress can take that away. Like my friend John has said, I'm never feeling safe that these laws are there, because for 4 years they're there, and the next 4 years, if someone else comes into Congress, they're no longer there. And that's why we have to continue to vote for people that will keep human rights in place for everybody and embrace, you know, everything about everyone. But yeah, I'm hoping, Kevin.
Hey, thank you for sharing your viewpoint.
This is not a dating site, so I'm not worried what I'm saying. So.
Okay.
Joli, I just want to thank you. It's 8:15, obviously it's past, but Joli, you did a fantastic job. There's never enough time because there's so much information, right?
Right.
I just want to say thank you. I, by the way, again, love the shirt. I hope that you bought me one on your vacation.
I can get you one. So I'm a hoarder. You know, I put my suitcase up, a very large suitcase, and it was only 43 pounds. And I'm like, how many more books can we put in there? We got it up to 48. And my friend, he still had to carry some of my books. So.
Oh dear. Thank you again, Joli. Thank you.
And thank you all for having me. And thank you to the community who joined.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks, team.
Thanks,
See you
Joli.
next time.
Thanks, Joli.
Bye, all.
Thank you. Thanks, Joli.